Hi, this is Professor McGuire, and welcome to this concept video focusing on the subject area of externalities as a foundation for environmental protection. This is the first in a set of shorter videos that I'll be providing that are conceptual in nature. So if you were to go to my YouTube site, you would see the detailed videos via playlists, most apparently, in the different subject areas that I teach on. Common amongst some of these subject areas, for example, environmental law, environmental policy, ocean law and policy, and administrative law. Common among many of these subject areas are these underlying concepts, one of them being externalities. So this set of videos, this is the first in a set of videos I'll be doing that are shorter in length, that are meant to provide an overview to anyone interested in the concepts that help us understand some of these environmental laws and policies that exist, both certainly within the United States, but also globally. So let's start with this subject area, this specific concept of externalities as a foundation for environmental protection. By way of introduction, the first conceptual issue, the first large-scale question we can ask ourselves when it comes to environmental protection is, does the government need to be involved, any government, need to be involved in protecting the environment in any way? Government is limited, and we know this from a policy standpoint. We know that governments do not have unlimited resources. And we also know that there are more asks on government than the available resources to meet those asks. Another way of saying that is that with limited resources, all governments must choose between competing wants and needs. I have a limited amount of a budget of resources available, and that can be through a mix of taxing. So I have income through taxing, and if I can't provide everything that I want to do with my tax income, maybe I'll do some debt financing. You think of individuals, governments, it's not quite the same thing to think of individual finances when you think of governments, because government's an individual that can live forever effectively, and through normal inflation can deal with debt in ways that individuals simply cannot. So there's important distinguishing characteristics. We don't really have time to get into that, but the point is, just as a means of trying to understand, government has the ability to provide for its citizens in a number of ways, but it can't do everything that either it wants to do or that the people, its citizens, want government to do. So within this world of limited resources, why does a government ever get involved with environmental protection? Why would it spend any of its resources? Aren't there other things that are more immediate, that are more desired, that it can spend its limited resources on, whether that's taking care of the current generation of people in terms of providing more medical care? Think of a public institution, a public health provision, for example. Could it do that? Could it help provide retirement benefits for elderly, more social safety nets in that way for people that are poor, etc.? There's not enough money going around for these things. Why would government spend any money whatsoever on protecting the environment? So why should environmental protection be something government should consider? Not only can we ask the question as to why government actually spends money or chooses to spend money on protecting the environment, but should it? Sort of stepping back and say, should other things take care of that? In other words, for example, doesn't the free market cover all of this anyway? In other words, if we start doing things that result in environmental harm, and that environmental harm just doesn't go away on its own, if it gets worse and worse, then, effectively you have scarcity. For example, if you pollute the air, and if the air is not getting clean, if the pollution rate exceeds the air or the air's ability to mitigate that pollution, right, to sort of just dissipate the pollution. So if the amount of pollution exceeds the ability of the air to sort of filter out that pollution, if we can think of it that way, over time, or just move the pollution away, if the dilution is less than the pollution rate, then clean air becomes scarce. And if it becomes scarce, then at that point, wouldn't the market react accordingly? Meaning that because it becomes scarce, it becomes more valuable. And if it becomes more valuable, now all of a sudden, the things that are polluting the air, They might be in the process of making other things. Well, maybe another company comes out that says, look, I can make those same things without polluting the air. So wouldn't market forces cover this anyway? Because then that new thing, that new entity may be competitive in the way that if clean air becomes scarce and people desire clean air, then, they would choose, this is the theory anyway, that they would choose that newer way of producing the thing that doesn't dirty the air, assuming other things being equal, like they're paying for the clean air, or they're willing to pay for the clean air, or that's imbued into the price of the things that that are being produced that are dirtying the air. So either, the people that are dirtying the air by producing the thing that people desire are being charged for dirtying the air, or the consumers, the end consumers, are willing to pay more for, or willing to pay for cleaner air once the air becomes really dirty. You can think of it that way. But shouldn't the markets, without government intervention, be able to deal with this? So part of the answer to this question is understanding the concept of externalities, which is the unwanted part of the thing that you actually want. We have two examples here. Banana peel. Most of the time, most of us who eat bananas, I'm sure there's some variance on this, but most of us, we're interested in the thing that's inside the banana peel. Most of the use for the banana for consumption purposes, most of the time, it's the inside of the banana, right? So the banana peel is the unwanted part of the thing. We want the banana that's inside. We don't want the peel. And there are many ways that we can think about that. Another example is for internal combustion engine automobiles. We're getting a lot of variance in terms of how automobiles are being developed nowadays, but still the majority of automobiles are internal combustion engine. They burn gasoline or diesel, hydrocarbons. We want the car as a means to, well, we want it for a number of reasons, but just from a utility standpoint, we want the car as a means of transportation, of readily available transportation for individual small groups of people. It provides a lot of option value. It provides a lot of, where I can move around to distant places at my will and have that transportation available to me. One of the externalities that comes from that, one of the things that we don't want, is the emissions, right? The thing that comes out, the result of burning gasoline, igniting gasoline in order to turn the internal combustion engine to make the motor run so we can get to where we want to be. So that externality in that case, it's not the banana peel. In this case, it's for the car, it's the exhaust. It's the stuff that comes out the tail end. And there's a number of things that come out of there that we don't want. They help to pollute the air in ways that are directly, provide problems to human beings in terms of health, in terms of, creating air pollution that has immediate effects on human well-being. They're also, because one of the hidden, or it has been historically hidden, potential externalities here is carbon. It also releases carbon. Carbon doesn't have an immediate threat on human well-being. And consuming carbon into your lungs, for example, doesn't provide any immediate threat to the health of your lungs or your respiratory system or anything like that. But carbon, we know today, vis-a-vis climate change, it aggregates in the atmosphere and it spends a lot of time. So when we take oil, let's say hydrocarbons out of the earth, they're sitting there in the earth and they're there for a very long period of time. Their residence time is very long, and we remove it and then we refine it and we turn it into gasoline or, diesel, different forms and variants, but into fuel. And then we burn that fuel. We now take that carbon that was stored in the oil, let's say under the ground, and we now move it into the atmosphere. And unfortunately, that carbon adds to the existing carbon that's in the atmosphere, the normal equilibrium state carbon in the atmosphere. And if that carbon was removed from the atmosphere naturally in, say, a day, maybe that's not a big deal. But the problem with climate change is it's the same thing. It's the rate of pollution versus the rate of dilution. The residence time in the atmosphere for that carbon is a long time. It's 100+ years. So when we add that carbon to the atmosphere, with all other things being equal, it now increases the concentration of carbon in a way that's going to have a detrimental effect long-term on human well-being. But the point is, When we have a car, we have the car for transportation, not for the exhaust that's coming out of it. When we usually get a banana, we want the inside fruit portion of the banana, not the rind, not the peel of the banana. That's not what we're looking for. So those are externalities, they're the things that we don't want. As far as individual behavior and externalities, two examples here of speeding and widgets to help us understand this notion of how individual behavior leads to externalities. As far as speeding is concerned, many of us know, at least in the United States, but in other countries, in the United States, we're not in kilometers, we're in miles, but we know that the speed limit is 65 miles per hour. But I regularly travel 95 miles per hour, even though I know it is against the law. So I regularly engage in individual behaviors that violate existing known laws and regulations. This happens all the time. Those of you who are watching this, who are in the United States, will know this. You'll know that when I get in my automobile, and you're probably responsible yourselves, that you'll travel faster than, and often the actual normal speed, the speed that's being traveled normally on our highways, exceeds the normal speed limit. Everyone is traveling at least 5-10 miles per hour over that speed limit, the stated speed limit. And often people travel much faster than that. Of course, if they get caught, then they'll get a speeding ticket. But what they're doing is they're weighing the relative costs and benefits and saying that, well, I've noticed that in the past, I haven't, or others haven't been caught. There's rarely do I see in my normal commute a police officer, a state trooper, a highway patrol officer. Rarely do I see them out there, looking for speeders. So it's unlikely, it's a low probability that I'm actually going to be caught. So therefore, I'm going to engage in this behavior, because the benefits is that I can get up later, my commute time is less, I can plan on leaving later, it'll take me less time, I can get to my destination faster. All of those things are sort of part of the calculus. It's the idea that I understand that I'm violating a societal norm, an expectation, but many others are as well. We're all sort of enjoying the benefits of that violation, where we're also externalizing the problems, the associated problems with that. And if we assume that speeding in part is regulated because it creates danger, and that, the faster you go, the less capacity you have to deal with that speed, and it's more likely that it can cause harm to both yourself and others, then what we're saying is that we're externalizing that threat of harm. We're externalizing that social norm and threat of harm for the benefit. And normally when we're defining that benefit, it's on a daily basis. What I mean by that is, as we're speeding, we're doing the calculation of the benefit in that moment and speeding for that moment, for that day. We're not doing the calculation for the prior 10 or 20 days that we've sped. We're only doing it in that moment for that day. And if we're really running late, for example, then we might speed some more, because the calculation is, I want the benefit of being able to get to my destination, whether that's my job, some sort of an important event, whatever it might be. I want to get there, and I want to get there timely. And that is the benefit of doing that exceeds the relative potential cost of either, most of us totally discount the cost of getting into an accident or causing an accident. And most of the time, it's the cost of being caught, and for the speeding violation. In terms of widgets, I make widgets. So I own a business and I make this thing called a widget. Let's just call it a physical thing. It could be anything, but I make a widget, and in the process of making that widget, it produces waste. It's like the automobile. It produces waste as a matter of exhaust. If I dump the waste, then I can sell my widgets at a competitive cost if I don't have to deal with the cost of the waste. But if I recycle the waste, then I am not competitive. So the incentives for me are clear. In both cases, the waste product, the thing I don't want when I make widgets, is something that I want to externalize, because it's not part of what I'm doing. It's not the main reason of what I'm doing. I'm not there to produce waste. I'm there to produce the thing that also produces waste in the process of producing the thing. Just like speeding, I'm in the process of utilizing my automobile to get to a destination. I'm not in the process of creating harm. I'm not in the process of, getting in an accident. That's not my purpose of why I'm speeding. Those are other things. And those things I want to, the likelihood, the increased probability of harm, let's call it that with speeding, if that's a true thing, then, I'm willing to, externalize that cost, at least off of myself. Maybe I don't want it to come on to others, but others now have to deal with it at the very least, because there I am speeding around them, and I can cause. And same thing with the widget maker. If I have very little to no incentive to recycle the waste, because if I deal with the waste, if I internalize the cost of my waste, then I'm no longer price competitive. I no longer will be able to sell my product. Those are both examples of externalities and the way in which those externalities affect individual behavior. And the traditional way of understanding and knowing about externalities is the tragedy of the commons. And the tragedy of the commons is really just about when short-term self-interest leads to effectively a tragedy for all. And there's many different examples. The fundamental example is the common being a common piece of land that is fixed in its dimensions. It's 1, 2, 3 acres, let's say, or hectares, depending on where you are. It's just a fixed dimension, and everyone has access to it. And if everyone has access to it, then they can use it in a number of ways. And in the traditional common ways, it's farmers having access to graze on that property with their cattle. And what ends up happening is that farmer A brings his cattle or her cattle onto the farm, their cattle. Farmer B brings their cattle onto the farm. They start grazing. Farmer A has 1 cattle grazing. Farmer B has 2 cattle. And Farmer A notices that, wow, Farmer B with 2 cattle, they're eating the grass, and, the grass is getting eaten, but they're getting the benefit with 2 cattle. I only have 1 cattle. I should go back and I should get 2 more cattle. I should have 3 of my cattle, because this is great. My cattle are feeding. I don't have to pay for the grass. And I noticed that once the grass is cleared by Farmer B, that grass isn't available to my cattle to graze. So then Farmer A gets 3 cattle, 2 more cattle, now has 3. Farmer B sees that, says, wow, geez, a lot of this grass is getting eaten up. Farmer A is enjoying it with 3 cattle. Now I better go and get my extra cattle, because before you know it, this is going to be gone. So what effectively happens is you have a race to the bottom, whereas those individual actions, which are completely rational in the moment, because they're saying, look, I better use it or I'll lose it. So that individual behavior and the incentives are clear. I want to use as much of this, but I'm assuming, based on what I'm observing, that if I don't use it, somebody else will, and therefore it won't be there available to me to use tomorrow or the next day. Sort of the traditional tragedy of the commons. When I cannot exclude the other people, the commons component, from the resource, then I want to use the resource in a way that maximizes my benefits, even if that results in, the diminishment of that resource, both for myself and for the others in the future. This was really put into practice and well understood by some work that was originally done by some others, but also I think sort of understood it from a popular sense by Mancur Olson's work with the logic of collective action. And what this did is this helped us understand how those individual behaviors can lead to these collective problems. This notion of externality analysis done on an individual level, can lead to really collective issues or collective problems. So in terms of incentives, we say environmental laws, environmental regulations, but the environment, government's involved in the environment in some ways. It may be needed to counter these individual incentives, because government deals a lot with common issues. That's what government is. Government's about taking in the collective interest. And when individuals act in a way that violates the collective interest, when they harm collectively, whether that's the commons in our example of the tragedy of the commons, or it's the highway, they make the highway more dangerous because they're interested, their self-interest in getting to where they want to be really quickly, exceeds, the interest, the collective interest. Or when the, manufacturer realizes that, look, if I can just get rid of this waste without having to sort of internalize the cost of the waste, then my products are competitive. And so that's my incentive is clear. I know I'm going to create this waste, and I want to discharge this waste and get rid of it in a way that I don't have to pay for it. I'm not responsible. And if that results in, for example, discharging the waste into a waterway that then, moves into the public domain. So you have a river, for example, that is not owned by that individual and now moves down and affects the water quality for others, for other uses. If it's about discharging the pollutants into the air, as a matter of, a result of the manufacturing process, I don't want to pay for that. I don't want to pay for the dirtying of the air. But as we explained at the beginning, of course, if the rate of pollution exceeds the rate of dilution, for the air, for example, then the air gets dirtier. And if the air gets dirtier, then we have a problem. And climate change is probably one of the great examples of where you have this collective issue from a lot of individual actions that aggregates because that carbon sits up there for so long. So in terms of incentives, the individual rational behavior leads to collectively irrational results, one of the main findings of Manker-Olson's work. So environmental laws may be needed to counter individual incentives. They protect the public benefit of environmental goods from potentially dangerous private action, like speeding. And they can also even the playing field when it comes to private actors. For example, making sure that if you're a manufacturer, how you handle the waste. So government can ensure that, look, I get it, you're going to be cost non-competitive, right? If you have to handle the waste, here's what we're going to do. We're going to make sure that everyone has to handle the waste, every single entity. And therefore, they have to internalize the cost of their waste. Now, using free market concepts in the free market, if somebody can come up with a better way of manufacturing that doesn't, or that diminishes that waste, excludes it or gets rid of it or diminishes it, now they have an advantage, and that advantage should be clear, and you should follow that lead. So now if we can produce these products that do not contain waste, for example, electric vehicles, maybe. So if the issue is carbon and maybe other things that are more proximate for human health, but if the idea is, boy, internal combustion engines are problematic because of the fuel source, and the fuel source creates a lot of pollution issues, many of which aggregate. Now, if we have an alternative, so it's, look, you have to, let's say auto manufacturing company, you have to start paying for the price of carbon or the price of the pollution, that's the deal. Now you can come up with technologies that, absorb that pollution and prevent it from leaving. Catalytic converters were a part of that process. Mandating that is something government's done in the past to limit the amount of pollution that comes out of vehicles, internal combustion engine vehicles. But carbon's a real issue. So if you started charging for carbon, for example, now there's a new way to make automobiles, a non-internal combustion engine way. And maybe that becomes the competitive way. And the free market will decide if you can make these vehicles, if you can make them in a way that the consumer likes, if it meets all of the other requirements, and now all of a sudden you can become incredibly competitive. And if you include an additional fee for the internal combustion engines for the pollution, then maybe that's the new way to go. So the idea is that, government can also level the playing field when it comes to private actors. So in essence, they incentivize private actors to act in the public good. And that's really about how government begins to become involved in these collective action problems that have to do with environmental issues. It really is about this fundamental. Now, part of this fundamental, when we talk about externalities, it's really about focusing on the margins versus the averages. And let me explain that. Normally, and this is in the environmental law, if anybody's interested or remember seeing this, if you look more in depth at the environmental law video lectures, we have this sort of ongoing discussion about the juxtaposition between an economist's point of view and an ecologist's point of view. As far as the economist, we call this the cartoon economist. Your generalized economist would say, look, everything's about a benefit cost analysis. And environmental harm caused by an activity must be balanced against the benefits of that activity. So if the benefits of making the widget exceed the environmental harm on an individual basis, the question is, how do you measure that? Do you measure it in the individual? Do you measure it at the aggregate? How do you measure it? That's really an important thing. But regardless of how you measure it, it can be measured in different ways, and then we must look at whether the benefits exceed the cost, how we define them. Of course, this assumes not only how we measure, when we measure, but it assumes that all the information is known, which means it assumes that all variables under consideration are properly being valued. All benefits and costs are known and correctly valued. This is something we call, in a perfect world, a total value analysis. Total value says we not only take the direct use values or market values, the things that we actually pay for, the things that we're looking for. That usually is, for example, if I make the widget, it's about the cost of the widget, excluding, if you can, the environmental externalities. It's all about just looking at the market value. What are you selling? What does it cost you to produce the widget without considering the harm, environmental harm, if you don't have to pay for it? And what does it cost to, produce and then sell? And then what is the, that's effectively, and what is the demand for this, for that, and what are people willing to pay? Therefore, and whether those, and what does that produce for society? What are those benefits versus what are the costs, the direct costs? The indirect and the non-use values are these other costs. We never knew, for example, that carbon was a problem early on when we were doing industrial and manufacturing, because we didn't understand the relationship between moving carbon from the ground into the atmosphere and the effect that had. For decades now, we have understood that relationship, and we've been watching how all of the costs associated with increasing carbon in the atmosphere, all of those aggregate costs, we often don't include those costs. We have a hard time even trying to account for how we would include those costs on individual behaviors or manufacturing behavior, individual firm manufacturing behaviors, etc. Coming up with a cost for carbon, for example. It's very hard to do, but that would be considered something that's an indirect use, right? So that'd be considered a cost that's related to a new or separate category. Get into more details on this total valuation. This will be a subject of its own sort of contextual lecture. But the idea here, just so you understand, is that an economist would say it's benefits versus costs, and we should focus on that. However, in doing so, what are we counting as a benefit? What are we counting as a cost? That's really the question. And from the ecologist perspective, any environmental detrimental activity must be banned. So the idea here is that, look, if we can see that there's any connection to an activity and it harms background environmental conditions, there's such a high value by the ecologist, and this is just a generalization. We're trying to make the juxtaposition arguments, the opposite sides of a spectrum arguments, the idea that it's either the economist or the ecologist. It's not both. It's not a mix of the two. This is a binary, which is an ineffective way of looking at this ultimately, but in order to understand the sort of juxtaposition, in order to get the idea of externalities, we can use this juxtaposition, this idea of an economist versus an ecologist as being polar opposites of each other, which they're not, but in order to do so, the idea is that there's a high value placed on background environmental conditions by the ecologist, just a super high value, because background environmental conditions before human interventions equals good environment for human well-being, where humans have developed and humans have existed over the past, let's say, 10,000 years of human development, into going from hunter-gathering to all of the associated complexity that we have in our societies nowadays, living in close proximity, 7+8 billion humans on the planet, moving further, how we all sort of work together. The background conditions have been good, generally speaking, for allowing humans to develop in this way. So they are paramount. They are the most important thing to consider. That's what the ecologist would say. And so anything that affects those background conditions, you should ban them. This takes a precautionary approach to interactions with the environment. It just says that we're just going to assume that anything that can affect those background conditions are not something we're looking for. That's what we mean by a precautionary approach. It assumes natural systems are integral to human well-being, that the environment sets the outer limits for human well-being. And it applies a systems-based equilibrium and exponential harm approach, harm aggregates, to the analysis. So it says, look, there's no such thing as a small harm. There's no such thing as dilution, because what ends up happening is that there's too many actors engaging in the same behavior. And if you look at it in isolation on an individual basis, it's like, yes, this is no problem because it's just one individual, but you can't look at it like that. You have to assume that whatever the harm is going to be something that aggregates over time. Now, this applies to some things more than others, but in terms of the notion of aggregation, it helps support government intervention, because any of us as individuals, what we end up doing is minimal. But if we do the same thing that billions of other people do, and if each of those things have a negative consequence, and if those consequences aggregate, if they don't just die off naturally, quickly by themselves, if they aggregate and come together, then that creates a real environmental problem. The best way to understand the sort of ecologist approach, if we're looking at total valuation as a way of trying to understand the limitations of the economist approach of benefit cost, then on the ecologist approach, the Lilypad problem is very helpful. And what we're trying to do here is understand the difference between looking at averages and looking at margins analysis. Another way of saying that is that the economist economists are all about looking at marginal analysis. I want to be clear on this. Economists will say the margins are where you look for benefits and costs. That's how you do that analysis. But in terms of environmental benefits and costs, at least for this explanation, it's more focused, the benefit cost analysis is more focused on averages, looking at general averages rather than on the margin. I'll explain what that means. But the Lilypad problem helps us understand the difference here. So the Lilypad problem is this the simple sort of math quiz, or one of these brain teasers, which says that, look, we have a Lilypad that doubles in size every day, and after 30 days, it completely covers a pond. And the question is, on what day does the Lilypad cover half the pond? Think about that for a minute. So 30 days, it covers the entire pond. It doubles size every day. So when does it cover half the pond? Well, it covers half the pond on the day before it covers all the pond, right? Because it increases in size every day, doubles in size every day. So it's one day before it covers the entire pond. So you will not recognize the problem of the Lilypad covering the pond at least until it covers probably half the pond. That's when it's really, wow, this is something to look at. And the problem is you only have a day to respond to that problem. This is one of the things, because it doubles, this is an example of exponential, the exponential effect of some problems, exponential growth. And what it's meant to represent is that if you only look at the Lilypad doubling on days 1 through 29, the vast majority, it really doesn't show itself to be an issue. And if you were to average the growth over 30 days, and you were to look at the average growth, measure the average growth of the Lilypad doubling in size every day for 30 days, then the average wouldn't seem like it's a problem, because it wouldn't be a large number relative to, the entire size of the pond. So the question then becomes, we don't look at the average when we make our analysis of whether this is a potential problem. We look at the margin. So we want to know, because of the doubling nature of the Lilypad, we want to know what's the difference, what's happening on day 28, day 29. We want to analyze those days on the margin to determine relative benefits and costs. So if we look at the Lilypad on day 1, it's very small relative to the pond size. And if we were to do an analysis of its effects, we would say the effects are not much. It's not much relative to, I don't know, some perceived benefits, but it's nothing to worry about. So if that was the equivalent of the Lilypad, if we were to equivocate it to something, it would be like a pollution. If we were to look at an individual dumping something into the pond or something, then it's like, well, that one individual action, the amount that they're putting in there of waste, it's really not that bad. There's plenty of dilution, that sort of thing. And the other problem is, if we measured all of that polluting activity days 1 through 29, and we only looked at it on the average, if we average those days out, we would still say that the amount is not significant relative to the size of the pond and its ability to deal with whatever it is. But that's the difference between looking at the average versus looking at the margins. If we analyze the issue from the margins, we can see the real problem, the real relative benefits and costs of the externality. Some people, in order to understand this a little differently, some people say, an individual really likes to do something like golf, and they prefer to go on play golf almost more than anything else. They get high benefits. They get high value out of golf. And on average, they get a lot of benefit. That's why they do golf, and they golf a lot on average. They try to do it every week, that sort of thing. But on any given day, if you think of golf as, I think 18 holes, right, is a full course. You think of somebody that's played 36 holes of golf, 2 full courses of golf in a day, hours and hours and hours spent. They're exhausted. They've played 36 holes. They're absolutely exhausted. Now the question becomes, somebody is interested in having them play one extra hole, a 37th hole. Now, if you look at the golfing from an average perspective, you will say that, oh, the benefits of golfing, generally speaking, for that individual far exceed the costs. They love to golf on average, and they like to do it almost more than anything else. So therefore, on average, golfing is better for them than almost doing anything else. They prefer to do it. But if you look at the 36th to 37th hole and you ask, what is the marginal value of that next 37th hole for that individual? All of a sudden, they're going to say to you that the value is extremely low. It's almost negative. It's all cost. At this point, doing the golfing is something that they just simply no longer want to do. They're exhausted. They've done it all day. They've done it for hours and hours. They've walked, whatever, and they're just exhausted. Golf doesn't bring them any marginal value at that point, at that moment. It doesn't mean tomorrow or next week that they won't have, again, serious value related to golf, the benefits, high benefits. It's just on the margin at that point in time. And that's what we're talking about here with the Lilypad, is that the costs, we have to look at the cost from a marginal perspective. And externalities are really about analyzing those costs and benefits on a marginal basis, not an average. So understanding all of this in terms of final thoughts to get a sense of externalities. Externalities are real, particularly when we talk about the environment, but often unaccounted for. We don't do a total value analysis of externalities. We often only attach the market values. We say, how much did it cost to produce the thing, and how much are they selling it for? What's the demand, right? What's the willingness to pay? What does it cost them to make it? What's the willingness to pay? Therefore, let the market take care of itself. But if those other costs aren't included in that analysis, if government's not forcing those costs to be included, or if people aren't demanding those costs to be included, then there's a failure. There's fundamentally a market failure, because you're not doing an apples to apples. You're not including all of those important aspects, and that includes environment. Because the environment is often considered something external to that market, often that's why externalities are created. If that commons is a commons, and the farmers are allowed to go on there and there are no rules about who can use it or how much they can graze, then you're going to see a race to the bottom, because they're just going to individually look at each other and say, wow, it's either use it or lose it, so hurry up. There's nothing else regulating my behavior. Same thing with speeding and many other things. Many environmental problems are about aggregations of the problem. They're all about looking at those marginal costs of the Lilypad, for example, or other things on those individual days. What is it day 29 versus day 1? The magnitude of the problem on day 29 is much worse than the magnitude on day 1. And this is something that is not well understood, I think, generally speaking, by including not only the general public, but also many of our policymakers, certainly our politicians, when it comes to things like climate change. Climate change is a problem that aggregates. That cost of carbon increases for every unit of carbon we add to the atmosphere. The collective cost, because that carbon isn't simply removed quickly, the collective cost increases. So that unit, that marginal unit, has an increased cost from the marginal units of carbon we were adding decades ago. It's much more costly today for each unit of carbon, but we don't think about it that way. As far as Manker-Olson, you and I make rational decisions that individually are okay. They make sense on an individual basis. They're completely rational, but collectively they lead to unwanted outcomes at the aggregate level, externalities. And that's why government must do something, because those individuals are doing exactly what you would expect them to do. So the idea here is that if only carbon moved to our atmosphere in a day, right? If only the dilution factor was a day, then, carbon wouldn't be an issue. But it doesn't move out of the atmosphere in a day, and we do not pay for this fact. And the cost on a marginal basis increases. TV means total value. If only plastic broke down like a banana peel. You know how we use that banana peel? We don't want the peel. We want the banana, the fruit inside, and we toss the peel. Well, the peel's great. It's organic. It breaks down quickly. There's no issues. There's no problem. So it's just compost. It turns back into the earth. Decomposers do their job, and it's gone within, depends on where you live, but in the warm weather, it's gone in days, if not earlier. It's within a week, it's gone. Imagine if plastic acted like that, right? But it doesn't. Plastic persists. It's one of the reasons we enjoy it and like it, is because it's hardy, it sticks around, but it persists in a way that can create problems, not an individual piece of plastic, but at the aggregate. Plastic then aggregates and it stays around and it creates other problems at the aggregate level. We don't pay for this fact, right? That's not included in the cost of producing the plastic. It hasn't been traditionally. There's from a total value perspective. So we need to see the marginal issues. One of the most important things about environmental problems and why government's involved is because we need to look at this from a marginal standpoint, not the average issues. That's the Lilypad example. We need to see these issues from a marginal analysis. What are we talking about in terms of today? What is that unit of carbon? What's its cost versus benefits today versus 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, as it continues to aggregate? And it's not just carbon, just using that as an example, many environmental issues. You know, there's this old, I'll say Elon Musk, I think at this moment, and this changes constantly, but Elon Musk is, I think, the richest human being in the world at the moment. But, the idea is that Elon Musk walks into a bar. Now I'm a billionaire. This is the problem with averages, right? So, there's 20 other individuals, you, me, and 18 other individuals. We're all, we're all not rich in any way. However, if we now include Elon Musk's net worth versus our 20 individuals, add it to our 20 individuals net worth, and we divide by 21, what we find out is that we're all billionaires. It's because Elon Musk has now just swayed. So the average now is way out of the norm. And so if we do an average analysis, right, if we look at averages, then we're all billionaires, but we know in fact we're not. That's just because Elon Musk happened to walk into the bar and just move the needle significantly in terms of average. It's one of the problems with using averages to determine whether there's a problem or not a problem, or the effects of things. That's why we have to look at the margins. So it's all about the margins for understanding externalities. So what I mean by that is when we do marginal analysis, when we look at the effects of things in its next unit, we can better understand environmental issues fundamentally. So externalities, in order to understand them, understand what they are, they're the things we don't want, but they are things that cause problems. And the best way of understanding how they cause problems is to look at them from a marginal analysis. So it makes sense for us probably to focus a little bit more in a next concept video on those margins. So thank you for your time. I hope you enjoyed this, and look forward to more. Take care.